the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. And in one of the drafts, when they go to Bree, Tolkien wrote in the margin, "Who is Strider?" This is the part that he didn't plan ahead. Originally, Strider, for 4 drafts, he was a hobbit ranger named Trotter. His real name was Peregrine Boffin, and Peregrine means wanderer, like a peregrine falcon.
Yeah.
But later on, he gave that name to Pippin, even though Pippin doesn't wander, he's never been out of the Shire, but he just liked the name. So for a long time, he was a hobbit ranger, and when he says, "I know that I look foul," I think he's thinking of this gnarly little hobbit.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, co-director of the Wade Center, and I am joined by my fellow co-director, David C. Downing, as well as our producer, theologian Aaron Hill. And today we are proceeding with a discussion of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Our last episode, we discussed his writing process by focusing on the short story Leaf by Niggle, and we want to really get into the text itself, which has been divided into 6 books. Hence, we will spend 6 sessions. David, why don't you explain why Lord of the Rings is divided into 6 books?
Okay, for those of you who don't know the Lord of the Rings, we're sorry to hear you've been in a coma for the last 40 years.
I was going to say.
Well, after The Hobbit was a success, it came out in 1937, the publisher said, we'd love to have a sequel. So this started out as a sequel to The Hobbit, begun in December of 1937, and it took him about 11 or 12 years to actually write it. In his letters, he says, I think I'll finish in 1939. I think I'll wrap it up in 1942. He keeps having these very optimistic ideas.
Sounds like me.
Yeah. Originally, he conceived it as one thick epic like Dune. He thought it was going to be one big book, and he wanted to give it to the publishers along with the Silmarillion. Some people say, why is he so coy about the idea that there's a god of Middle-earth? But if you read the Silmarillion, he makes it quite clear he believes there was the All-Father who created Middle-earth. In any case, by the time he got it finished, he wanted these as a pair. The publishers didn't want both of them, but they said they would consider Lord of the Rings. So after he finished in the late 40s, it actually took him until 1954 to get the first volume published.
Oh, wow.
The publisher said, this is too thick. The whole idea of epic fantasy that didn't exist before Tolkien. He pretty much created the genre of epic fantasy.
Yeah.
So they said, let's divide it into thirds and give each one a separate title. And so the Fellowship of the Ring was books 1 and 2. The Two Towers is books 3 and 4. And The Return of the King is books 5 and 6. And interestingly, he didn't like those titles himself as we get on in the discussion. We'll talk about what his preferred titles were.
But somebody else came up with a suggestion for these titles?
Well, apparently he agreed to them eventually, but they weren't his best ideas for titles. For the second two.
Both of us have dealt with that in our publishing, where the publishers think a different title will be more marketable. And sometimes they come up with a title that is not consonant with the contents of the book. So this doesn't surprise me at all. One of the fun little things we have at the Wade is a display of various books, book covers by our 7 authors, and one of them is
The Two Towers.
Which is the second book. And we show how publishers design different cover art during different decades. And it shows how marketing changes according to the way culture changes. And it's so fun to look at these radically different book covers. Knowing they are all supposedly advertising the exact same content.
Yeah, some of the best ones are from like the 70s and
70s and 80s.
They're really weird.
Yeah. So to those of you who can possibly visit the Wade, come see that fun display. But let's get back then to the whole issue of these various books. So why you explained why it's 3 different volumes, David, but why 6 books?
Well, he did write it as 6 books. He thought of it as an epic.
So
he
it
didn't
was
break
one
it up
big
into
volume
books.
with 6 books.
Okay.
And so they just divided into 3 sources. Originally, there was a shortage of paper in England, and they weren't sure if this thick of a fantasy story would sell well. Normally, when you write a book, the publishers say, we'll give you, back in those days, $1,000 advance, and then we'll give you 10% of any profits we make. They told him, we're not sure if this is going to sell, and we're going to bring it out in installments. And so we're not going to give you an advance, but if it does sell well, we'll give you 50% of the royalties rather than 10%, which is the best deal an author ever made in history.
Really?
Because Lord of the Rings has sold 150 million copies. And Tolkien and his heirs are eligible for 50% of the profits made on those books. So,
as I read book 1 from Fellowship of the Ring, I was struck how this mimics, or anticipates, I should say, modern television series, because Tolkien has to start with a recap. So he has a prologue because he has to explain the whole Bilbo story from The Hobbit in order to contextualize what's going on once he starts the Fellowship of the Ring. And then where book 1 ends is a total cliffhanger.
Yeah.
But that's so much like a television series where you have something horrible and you think, oh no, they have been killed. And then next episode starts. Oh, they came back. There's an explanation for that.
Well, that's also like the old serial adventure stories that Lewis and Tolkien would have read in magazines. Tune in next week. So I'm sure he was used to that style of the big build-up.
A lot of the chapters feel that way. Like they're almost self-contained little sections that you could, it's almost like he could read it in an installment, a chapter every day or every night or something like that. He has a line I wanted to mention about the finishing the book. There's a line in the story that Gandalf says to Bilbo when he's talking about leaving his book. And I wondered if maybe there's a little bit of autobiography leaking through here. Yeah. And he says, Gandalf says to Bilbo, but nobody will read the book, however it ends. So there's this trepidation of like, no matter how much you work on this book, Bilbo, nobody's going to read it. And I just felt like maybe that was a little bit of Tolkien sneaking through the novel.
Well, relevant to our past conversation about Levi Niggle.
Yeah.
How his painting is going to be regarded. I would like to start then on the very first page, because first pages are significant. You can see adumbrated what is to come later on. And of course, the opening line when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence. There was much talk and excitement in Hobbit Town. So he gets...
The opening was, he was the best of hobbits, he was the worst of hobbits.
That would be appropriate,
Why
wouldn't
does
it?
that opening strike you? Oh, let me tell you something quickly about, I mentioned an earlier episode, but in his handwritten draft of this first page, the first draft starts out when M, and he didn't even finish the 4th stroke on the M. There's only 3 strokes.
Wow.
And then he changes it to when Bilbo. So I love the fact that the second word of this epic he got stuck on because he wasn't sure about the name at first.
Wow.
Well, see, that makes me think of, because later on, after everything happens, they refer to Bilbo in the past as Mad Baggins. Makes me think of, remember? Because he becomes
Mad
a myth,
Baggins, that's right.
And they refer to him as Mad Baggins. Anyways,
it's almost like he felt, he had to give us just more foundational material before he went on.
Well, he has other characters that he went through a lot of names. One of them was Mungo. I wonder if at some point he was going to say, when Mungo Baggins.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
He loved to think about different kinds of names. Crystal, go ahead and go back to your point of why you picked out that very first sentence.
Well, it reminds us of Bilbo Baggins and then goes into the riches he brought back and then how his fellow people in the Shire...
fellow hobbits.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hobbits in the Shire are just amazed that he's been unchanged. And by the 3rd paragraph, you have someone say, it isn't natural and trouble will come of it. And I found that phrase significant because it seems to me one of the things that Tolkien is exploring is this tension between the natural and the unnatural. How do we define what is natural? And you have actually just on the very next page, they refer to the Brandy Bucks who actually use boats. And people say, oh, that is unnatural.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so right in his opening, you see that he is dealing with the tension between culture and nature, how often we consider that which is unnatural is just the way we've been trained to think about it. Kind of like when Queen Victoria said it was unnatural and unchristian to give women the vote.
Oh, wow.
So and today we just think of that as just outrageous, but she was just reflecting the attitudes of her time. And Tolkien was smart enough to recognize this as a problem. And then, especially when you start having trees that seem to have human characteristics. Well, trees are natural, but is it unnatural that trees would have spirits? I mean, that goes back to classical tradition where trees did have spirits. The dryads.
I was going to say, I think a lot of what Tolkien does in this story, I felt reading through it again, was he sort of he recalibrates for you what feels natural so that it no longer seems unnatural for trees to walk and to talk. And there's a fox in the story that stops and wonders why they're hobbits out here. And you're thinking, foxes, do they have internal monologues? Do they talk?
Right.
Do they think like humans? But he just throws things like that in the story, and nature becomes personified to such a degree that I think by the time you're done reading it, it recalibrates what you feel is natural, so that when you put the book down, you see the world through a different lens. At least that's how I felt reading it.
Well, one of the few, neither Lewis nor Tolkien liked American writers that much, but Tolkien liked Hiawatha. And one of the characteristics of the Hiawatha, the Longfellow poem about the Indian, was the animism, that nature was alive. It was a part of the process. Even in these early pages, he talks about spring coming and the green showing up on the fingers of the trees.
Yes.
So early on, he personifies trees and other inanimate objects.
He does that all throughout the story.
He does.
Gandalf's wagon toils up the hill and doubts sleep. And there's just all these kinds of inanimate things that he personifies throughout the story. And he throws them in small little ways.
And sometimes they're just metaphoric, but that also destabilizes our sense of, is there really a spirit behind this particular object, or is it just a metaphor? But I like that because metaphors are cultural, but then the idea of all of nature being animate is a celebration of nature.
Yeah, and you see that come through, obviously, most clearly in The Ring. Right, the ring comes to Bilbo and it chooses to leave.
Yes, it has its own agency.
It betrays people and it has its own agency, and it reaches its highest, its zenith in the story in the ring, but it's mixed throughout the story. So the sky speaks and streams wander and lose their direction and things like that.
That's a difference of the ring from the Hobbit. In the Hobbit, it was just a magic ring that made you invisible. But it wasn't sinister. Tom Shippey, the great Tolkien scholar, says it's just a stage prop. But as he thought about the sequel, he early on decided that the ring needed to have a lot more significance. And it becomes sort of the spirit of Sauron embodied in an inanimate object.
Right.
I have a Hindu colleague at Elizabethtown College who thought that Tolkien was a secret Hindu because he loved animism. He felt like they were local places that either had a good spirit, a benign spirit to them, or like the old forest in the section we read
very
today.
Very much alive.
But it's very resentful and hostile.
Yeah.
And it's especially Old Man Willow. So there is a kind of love of animism. He found a lot of that in Norse mythology, so I don't think he had to go all the way to Hinduism to find that. But
Right. But that is a great example, and I'm glad we're talking about The Ring because, of course, Tolkien presents the ring in the very second page, but he, as he does with trees, he personifies it, as Aaron made that point. It actually, when Bilbo feels like it is an eye looking at him.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that anticipates later when Bombadil picks up the ring and holds it up to his eye and looks through it. And so it's preparing us for this idea that the ring is watching things. The ring can control things. And that is why the evil characters want to get control of it.
Yeah.
And why the good characters resist taking the ring. We shouldn't get too far ahead in the story, but
right.
Where we saw Gandalf saying, no, don't give me the ring.
Yeah. He doesn't want to be tempted by it.
Well, let's get back to the first chapter.
Yes.
And I wanted to mention Bilbo and Frodo's birthday in the story is September 22nd. And interestingly enough, this episode is going to air on September 24th. Which I can assure you we did not plan.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay.
No,
just
joking.
Secret plan of Crystal. But it is interesting in the story that he has Bilbo and Frodo have the same birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And now we don't need to get into differences between the movie and the story, but in the movie, Frodo is young. And when he leaves on his journey, but in the story, there's like a 17-year gap between Bilbo's birthday party and I think Frodo's like in his 50s when they leave, and so there's a lot of passage and of time, and Tolkien focuses on the passage of time in the story and tells you the months of when they're journeying.
Well, and even the significance of the birthday, because later on in this book 1, we discover that Sméagol gets the ring and he uses as an excuse to grab the ring from his friend the fact that it's his birthday.
Yeah.
And he actually kills his friend in order to get control of the ring. And then, of course, he becomes known as Gollum.
Yeah.
But it is a radically different view of birthdays. The birthday that is of a greedy person who expects gifts for themselves, whereas Tolkien tells us at the very start that for hobbits, the birthday person gives gifts to everybody else. They don't expect something for themselves.
Yeah.
So it creates these mere opposites of selfishness, wanting the ring for its power, versus the entire journey of the hobbits is unselfish to get rid of the ring.
I already don't like my birthdays. If I had to give everybody else a present, I'd really be depressed about my birthdays.
Tolkien does focus a lot on Bilbo giving away gifts in the first chapter, and he reveals it later on, I think in the second chapter when Gandalf was talking to him, and they apparently had a plan, and he says that the party business, that's what this party business was all about, to give away lots of birthday presents and somehow make it easier to give it, meaning the ring, away at the same time. And so there's this idea that in order for him to stop possessing the ring and be able to give it away, he needed to also give away gifts at his birthday and then leave all of his things behind and leave his house and stuff. And so, you see a definite contrast between Bilbo and Frodo and then Sméagol as hobbits.
Yeah, because he originally was a hobbit before he became Gollum. And you mentioned the fox's point of view on the hobbits. He doesn't do that later in the story. He was amazing, and he didn't outline the whole story in advance. He worked his way forward, and during the birthday celebration, there's a great dragon that comes down, and it says,
the firework.
Yeah, swept by them like an express train. And that's the only time he makes a reference to our world or our industrial world.
Really?
Well, I have other examples. Go ahead.
Anyway, in general, he decided he wanted Middle-earth to be a sub-creation, a secondary world, so that he wouldn't remind us. We've talked about this before. Lewis says it sounded like a vacuum cleaner or a Hoover, or it looked like men sitting by the side of the road drinking tea out of tins, whereas he assiduously avoids that. Tolkien does. He doesn't want to remind people of our primary world, although you're claiming there are other ones besides the express train.
Yeah. I'm kind of surprised since we've discussed, as in our podcast over a month ago, Revising the Ring, how he tried to get rid of all those references to the contemporary world. How did he leave express train in? Trains weren't even invented in Britain until the 1820s. So,
but by the time he's writing, he's really remembering his childhood. In many ways, the Shire is turn of the century England. Because they have a post office.
Well, that's the one I was thinking of, the post office.
Right.
Because it was first invented in London in 1643. I actually looked it up.
Oh, you're sure it wasn't 1642? 1643.
Yeah.
As I say, the general atmosphere, they have tea kettles, which I'm not sure when those were invented, the post office. But in general, he stays away from any reference to something that would remind you of our modern world.
So it's all sort of pre-industrial.
Yes, and it's it's somewhat like the Middle Ages. It's supposed to be our Earth, basically England. He says at one point that the Shire has the same latitude as Oxford. And it's this misty past before there were any records by human beings.
Yeah.
But actually, the general life of the horses and carriages and the pubs and all that is very much turn of the century England.
So one of the questions I had early on, David and Crystal, was you get these hints that Gandalf he knows about the ring, and you get the hint that he knows something about its story, but you don't really know everything. And then later on, he goes off and he learns more, and then he has conversations with Frodo and things like that. But it seems very murky what Gandalf knows and when he knows it through the story. Was that something that evolved during the writing process, David, or...
What did he know and when did he know it?
Yeah.
I think that part, he decided early on that the ring was going to be evil. And so later on in the story, he's going to tell how he figured out that this ring was the ring. Remember when he throws it in the fire and that famous, those lines come up about one ring to rule them all. So I believe at this point, two of the things he decided early on were that the ring was this power of domination captured in an object, and it had its own consciousness. And also that Gandalf at some point was going to die and then be reborn. So those two concepts came very early on. Other concepts, including people's names. There's 4 drafts of the book 1 that we read, going all the way to Rivendell, in which Frodo is named Bingo. And so he had a lot of fluidity on other plot points.
Gotcha.
But he even knew that the Dark Rider, who, when they're trying to leave the Shire and this rider comes along and kind of sniffs at them, he knew that his name was Khamul, Khamul. But he never mentions that anywhere in the story. So I would say those two parts he did know.
Gotcha.
He was feeling his way forward. We discussed this in an earlier episode, that originally when they were hiding behind a tree and they heard a horse coming, it was going to be Gandalf.
Really?
They was going, it's only Gandalf. We thought it was one of those black riders. And then Lewis said, well, the hobbits are more interesting when they're in un-hobbit-like situations. And Tolkien took that to heart. And he says, I think we need to get out of the Shire. I actually think for an epic, one of my students compared it to an airplane ride. He says he taxis and then it finally takes off and the story really gets going.
Yeah.
And then at the end, when it lands, there's kind of a longer, slower period, the scouring of the Shire. We'll get to that eventually. But he's really thinking Hobbit, the whole episode with the old man Willow and the surprise that the two of them want to come with Sam and Frodo. It's a little bit slow. To me, it doesn't really pick up until you get to the Barrow Downs and then you get to Bree and meet Strider.
Yeah.
So he was thinking very Hobbity. It's kind of episodic and Hobbity until they get to Bree.
Yeah, it's halting. You go through stretches where it's really great and the plot is moving and there's really great dialogue, and then he gets off into these diversions of Sam's father. What's the name? What is Sam's? Hamfast. Talking at the pub and telling these stories, and he sort of takes these diversions into the past and into other stories and things like that, which are interesting. But they, at the beginning of a story, they can kind of wear on you because you want to get moving.
Yeah. I should mention the name Hamfast means stuck at home. It means fast. Ham means home. So all their names, even when they call him the Gaffer, that's English slang for grandfather.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah, and Samwise, the name literally means semi-wise or half-wise. He's got a lot of wisdom, but he's kind of means the same as sophomore.
Well, and a lot of people don't even realize that Tolkien borrowed the term Middle Earth from medieval literature. When I taught medieval drama at UCLA, my students were freaked out the first time they read the play The Fall of Adam and Eve that was part of the 14th century York cycle. And it says that when Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden by an angel, they were pushed into Middle Earth. And the phrase is actual Middle Earth. And in a lot of these medieval plays, they talk about Middle Earth because it's in the middle between paradise or heaven above versus Sheol, hell beneath. And so they are having to function in this place where good and evil from upper levels and lower levels are in battle until, of course, salvation through Christ.
And it actually goes back quite a bit further than the Middle Ages.
The
Norse
word
mythology.
is a Middle English word, which Tolkien actually told his publishers. So Tolkien credited it to Middle English.
Oh.
But if you read Norse mythology,
Yes.
they talk about Midgard,
Right.
which is translated Middle Earth. Literally, it's like the middle garden or the middle yard.
Huh.
But even this phenomenon that both of you are talking about, that you feel it drags in places, makes it all the more amazing how these novels captured the imagination even of young people.
Yeah.
I remember in junior high school how everybody was talking, have you read The Lord of the Rings? Oh, it's so cool. Even junior high school kids were charmed and their imaginations energized by Tolkien's power of imagination.
Yeah.
So they weren't finding these passages dreary at all.
Well, it's interesting that both Lewis and Tolkien caught on in America before they caught on in England. The Narnia Chronicles were published once a year from 1950 to 1956, and they became much more important to American readers, and then there was a rebound back to English readers. And same thing with Lord of the Rings.
Really?
It came out in hardback in the mid-50s, 54 and 55, but those are fairly expensive editions, and not a lot of adults were picking them up.
Yeah.
But when they went to paperback, that's when it really took off as a series. And I remember the same thing, Crystal, everybody saying Frodo lives. Part of the surprise was both the culture and the literature. There was a lot of emphasis upon evil, conspiracy, existential angst. In high school, you're reading Camus' The Stranger, where the guy kills someone for no good reason, and he gets thrown in jail.
Or the plague.
Yeah, the plague.
Yeah.
There was a lot of even Catcher in the Rye. It's kind of a downbeat story about this maladjusted adolescent. So when you start reading Lord of the Rings, there's something refreshing about meeting so many good characters.
Yeah.
Yes.
I remember the first time I read the Lord of the Rings, it came to a chapter called A Conspiracy Unmasked. And I said, oh, here we go. These other guys are going to be evil. Merry and Pippin are spies for the evil people. And it turns out the conspiracy is they're going to all go together. They don't want to separate.
They've been planning this the whole time.
Yeah. I think unconsciously people really liked literature in which you met a lot of good characters.
Right.
They didn't turn out to be hypocrites or spies.
Well, there is clear evil in the story, but then he even gives characters like Smeagol. He says that he wasn't wholly ruined.
Right,
there was a corner of his mind that was still his own. So even characters that you would want to hate or to loathe, he talks about the pity of Bilbo, as refers to Smeagol. And so there's this sense in which you shouldn't just kill things that you think are evil.
Right.
You should see if there's something worth redeeming in them. Let's talk about chapter 2. I wanted to talk about a couple things in chapter 2. So what was interesting to me was, and I had forgotten about this, where at the beginning, after Bilbo's birthday party, and he vanishes in the middle of at the end of his speech, and then he disappears, and they don't know where he goes. He has this paragraph about how people kept telling this story for, I think, a year and a day, and then it passed into legend. And he essentially gives you an insight into how true things become myth, which I thought was very relevant given everything that we've talked about with him convincing Lewis that, myths could be true. And so he has this line, and it says that it became a fireside story for young hobbits. And eventually Mad Baggins, becomes this favorite character of legend and lived on long after the true events were forgotten. And so there's this sense that there are true things that happen and people keep telling the true story. And eventually it becomes a story in its own right. But that doesn't mean that it's not referring to something that was true. It's just the truth gets forgotten over time as the story takes on a life of its own.
I had that happen with a student once. We were talking about history and myth, and we were talking about the American Revolution. And I was saying, in a way, George Washington became larger than life. And the whole idea that he could throw a coin across the Potomac River or the Rappahannock, whichever river it was, which was like
cutting down the tree and
cherry
saying,
tree, right?
Yeah, I can never tell a lie.
Yeah, and my student said, yeah, that whole thing about like they got in a boat and they crossed the river on Christmas Eve and surprised. And I go, no, that one's true. And they go, really? They got in a boat on Christmas Eve? And Yeah, so you're right. Myth and history can get mixed up in people's minds.
Yeah. Well, but the assumption is that that because these other stories about George Washington aren't true, you could see how people would begin to question other things.
Right.
Or if something is a myth, we assume there was never any truth behind it.
Well, we talked about that in a recent episode, how the word myth has actually become corrupted since the development of Enlightenment sensibilities to just mean untrue, where myth means a story that explains the origin and significance of things.
Yeah. Well, you see it with, that was a very popular thing in modern culture, where they would go back and find a myth and they'd say, oh, well, they just came up with this because they wanted to come up for an explanation for why thunder happened. So they invented Zeus and then you get stories of Romulus and Remus and the founding of Rome, and they just assume, well, there's no truth to that. Everything that's myth is false. And, Tolkien and Lewis are fighting back against that. So I just thought it was neat that he included something almost as throwaway as Bilbo passing into legend and becoming Mad Baggins in the story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to get across your viewpoint about myth without going and giving an academic dissertation on it.
Right.
Well, it's also funny how parochial people are. They'll say some real obvious proverb, and they'll say, as we say in the Shire, or as we say in Bree, and they don't realize that these are universal proverbs. They all think that they invented it. So there's a lot of subtle satire. I also liked everybody was wondering what gifts they would get, and they all came around. He doesn't really idealize hobbits in general. We're seeing the best of the hobbits.
Yeah.
But the Sackville Bagginses, I wonder if there's a bit of a slanting satire on Vita Sackville West. She was a Bloomsbury Group member who was very modernist and had a very unconventional lifestyle.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, she was almost the exact same age as Tolkien, and he may have been thinking about even her parents, who were aristocrats, who were famous for both her mother and her father having multiple affairs.
Right.
And so this whole idea of aristocrats who think only about themselves, indulging themselves, appropriating everything for themselves. And then their daughter, Vita Sackville West, she and her husband both had both heterosexual and homosexual affairs. And it is just about going after your own satisfaction, which is what the Gollum is about.
Yeah.
The ring, my precious.
But let's not get into Gollum too much. Let's stay with book one at this point. We don't know too much about Gollum.
Yeah.
Well, we find out.
We do from The Hobbit.
Right.
Well, but we also find a lot when Gandalf comes back, he does give us an account of Smeagol and of his origins. And I remember the first time I was reading the story, I thought, how does he know all this stuff? And then later on, you find out that he and Aragorn captured him, and that he was a liar, and he told them these stories, and eventually they were able to get the truth out of him. And so we learn a little bit about the ring. So why don't we talk a little about the ring here? Because
even at the party, Bilbo knows that he has to pass the ring on to Frodo, but he has trouble giving up on it. He actually uses that phrase from The Hobbit that Gollum uses, my precious, and he repeats the word precious a couple of times.
Notable to me was Gandalf tells him, he says, stop possessing it.
Yes.
And that word possessing, so, you talk about possessions, but spirits possess people. And so there's this sense in which he was viewing it as it's his own, it's his possession, and he had to surrender it and give it up. And it's significant that Gandalf says he's the only person that was able to give it away willingly. Which he
and even then it was difficult.
Yeah, well, and then he hints that Bilbo was only able to give it away because he was meant to, that there's this power behind things that allows him to give the ring away. And so, to me, one of the interesting themes of the story is stewardship and possession, and this idea of whether you own something and it belongs to you or you're just a steward of it. And that's a very clear contrast that he uses throughout the story in multiple places. You see it later on with Tom Bombadil when they ask Goldenberry, does Tom Bombadil own the land? And she laughs and she says, no, the grass and the fields, they belong to themselves. And so there's this theme of stewardship and possession, and it kind of like comes to a head in the ring.
Right. That is relevant even to the horse that Sam actually becomes very affectionate towards.
Bill the pony?
Yeah, Bill the pony. Because the person who owned it didn't take care of it, and it was all scrawny, and it was just the only horse they could find after their own horses were stolen. But because they exercised stewardship towards this horse and treated it well and made it part of the journey, the horse gets healthier and healthier and becomes part of the community of hobbits.
That was a funny description when he first talks about the pony. He says it was scrawny and underfed and depressed, but it didn't look like dying anytime soon. So they decided to go ahead and buy it.
Yes, the humor, the subtle humor that Tolkien puts in, and it's just the way he puts his words together. It really is quite delightful.
Yeah, I was just going to mention two other things related to the stewardship and the possession. So there's that famous line about, we have to, all we have to do is decide to do with the time that is given to us.
Right.
And that theme is throughout the story of, we didn't choose this. The ring came to Bilbo, and then it came to Frodo because there's this other power that's behind the things. And then later on when they're talking about the Shire, the elf Gildor says, "But it is not your own Shire. Others dwelled here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more." And there's this idea that you can put fences up, but the world doesn't belong to you. And so the ring is this ultimate thing that everyone wants to possess, but in the end, it ends up possessing you. And you sort of fade away as the ring takes away your humanity.
And that even started happening a little bit to Bilbo. He had this kind of spiritual sturdiness which protected him from the effects of the ring more than other characters. But even he says, it's not really being well preserved. He says, I feel like I'm spread out like butter, not enough butter over toast. So he feels like somehow his spirit is being attenuated and overstretched. And he doesn't realize it, but that's the effect of the ring on him. It gives him eternal youthfulness or a long life, but it's also kind of draining his spirit in ways. I think that's part of his restlessness and his wanting to get to Rivendell. He doesn't realize it, but he needs to get away from the ring.
One of the things that we started talking about earlier is Pippin and Merry's joining of Frodo on the journey and the revelation that they had figured out about the ring already, because one of them had seen Bilbo as the Sackville Bagginses were approaching and he suddenly disappears. And what is so delightful about Merry and Pippin is that they are not some of these self-serving, possessive types, that they are ready to sacrifice themselves for Frodo and his mission.
Right. We should mention the Sackville Baggins, that he couldn't avoid any kind of a pun that had to do with sacks or bags or tunnels. Later on, he says, my name will be Underhill. But every possible pun he can come up with on digging and burrowing. His aunt lived at a place called Bag End, and so he remembered that address. That came from his own life. But even Mickle Delving means much digging. So one of the towns where they live in Hobbiton. He just loved to work in every possible pun he could come up on digging and holes and things.
Right.
So actually, I wanted to ask you, and we've talked about this previously, what is the deal with Tom Bombadil? He's one of those interesting characters. If you have only ever watched the movies and not read the books, Tom Bombadil did not make it into the movie, much to some people's chagrin and much to some people's delight. He's an interesting character. So let's talk a little bit about Tom Bombadil and his chapter. They go to this old forest, and eventually the forest leads them to this old willow man, and he captures them, and then Tom Bombadil comes and rescues him. But he's a very mysterious person in the story. So what's going on with Tom Bombadil?
Well, early on, he was still thinking about stories for his children.
Tolkien.
The Hobbit came out of stories he was telling his children. And one of them actually had a little Dutch doll with a blue coat, which they called Tom Bombadil. And he wrote a series of poems called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, some of which get into Lord of the Rings. After their encounter with the trolls, Sam sings this song about the guy who kicks the stone troll and hurts his foot. That's actually a poem that he'd used earlier in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And even Goldberry comes up. One time, one of the kids stuck the other son's Tom Bombadil doll in the toilet and got its hair all wet. So J.R.R. Tolkien tried to tell his kids, don't worry about the wet hair. That's just because he looked into a stream and he saw this beautiful maiden named Goldberry, and he fell into the water, and that's why his hair's wet. So he just spontaneously made up this story.
Oh, wow.
And then suddenly we've got Goldberry is the consort of Tom.
Yeah.
He said in the letter that Tom represented the spirit of the vanishing Oxfordshire countryside. That it really, like you were talking about earlier, this country is its own thing. It has its own being.
Yeah.
It's not owned by us.
Yeah.
He did say vanishing because he felt like more and more things. There were highways and things being fenced in. He originally thought of Tom Bombadil as a much more key character.
Really?
When the Barrow-wights were going to start following them, and they were going to morph into the Black Riders.
Oh, okay.
And Tom turns around and holds out his hand like halt.
Oh, really?
And when he does that, he has a power over them, just like he does over Old Man Willow. At the very last page of this book, Frodo tries to get the Black Riders to turn back. And he says, go back, go back. And he says, but he was no Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
And at that point, Tolkien had forgotten that Tom Bombadil never does that with the Black Riders or with the Barrow-wights.
Oh, so that's like a remnant of an earlier draft.
Yeah, he was writing many drafts, and sometimes he forgot. I think he forgot that. I wanted to mention that Tom Bombadil. There's a character in the Finnish Kalavala who's this very jolly character who casts spells on evil characters.
Oh,
so some people think that he loved to go through his beloved mythology and pick out parts that he could adapt for Middle Earth.
What is the Kalavala for our listeners who maybe aren't aware?
The Kalavala is a collection of stories about Finnish folklore.
Oh, okay.
And it was collected not till 1830 or so, but it was new material. People forget that all this Norse mythology that we talk about with Thor and Odin and Loki was only discovered in the 19th century. So this was a whole new mythology, and everybody was fascinated.
You mean discovered to people outside of those countries?
Yeah, well, it was brought to English-speaking people.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the character in the Kalavala
whose name I wish I could remember. It's a very complicated name. It's not nearly as easy to say as Tom Bombadil.
So where did the name Tom Bombadil come from? Did Tolkien just make that up?
Yeah, I think the family made that up as the name for this Dutch doll that they had in the house.
That's interesting.
Later on, he decided he didn't want him to be a major character. We'll wait till book 2. But when they're trying to decide what to do with the ring, one of them says, well, why don't we give it to Tom Bombadil? It doesn't affect him.
Yeah.
And that's the question that critics want to talk about is why doesn't the ring affect him? Right. Why doesn't it make him invisible?
Yeah, he views it almost as a trinket. Like Crystal said, he puts it up to his eye and he kind of laughs about it, and he treats it, like it's light and it has no weight or something.
Yeah, well, he seems to be a spirit of nature who's above all of machinations of conscious
because he tells them a lot of ancient stories, and then he essentially says that like he remembers when the trees were planted and, he almost before anything existed. So you get the sense that he's this really old, deeply spiritual
almost
being.
Supernatural.
Yeah.
He saves them a couple times. Like when Old Man Willow is absorbing Merry and Pippin, and he just shows up and sings to the tree, and the tree releases them.
He says, eat earth, go to sleep.
Well, my friend who's the Hindu scholar says that he's very similar to Hamatreya, which is the spirit of nature. There's a great poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson called Hamatreya, where the farmers say, that's my land and that's my lake, and over there you'll see my forest. And then the earth comes back and says, they said I was theirs, but now they're just taking up 6 feet of soil underneath my feet. So in what sense did they possess me?
Yeah.
It's pretty much the same idea that we've been talking about.
I was going to say, yeah, he really drives that home. One last question about Tom Bombadil. There's a refrain that he keeps saying over and over again, and I wondered if maybe this was something that Tolkien said to his children, because there's a theme of nightmares and stuff throughout the story. Right. And I don't know if it's Goldenberry or if it's him that says, have peace now until the morning. Heed no nightly noises. For nothing passes door and window here save moonlight and starlight and the wind off the hilltop. Good night. And they repeat that numerous times.
Right.
Heed no nightly noises. Was that something that came from his own life? Or
I have to wonder. I don't know for sure, but he was very sensitive to his children's nightmares. The severed hand that we see with the Barrow-wight, one of the sons had a frequent nightmare of a severed hand that was trying to open the curtain. Tolkien actually dealt with the nightmare by saying, well, describe it and I'll draw it. And there's a color drawing by Tolkien of this red claw hand, which is trying to open the curtain. I think it's called Maddo. It actually has a name. And in a way, he was trying to do therapy for the children by saying, well, here it is. Here's objectified. Here's what it looks like. And that made it not scary for the children.
Yeah.
So I believe that some of his children's nightmares actually did get into the story.
Interesting. Huh. So eventually they make it to, what is it, the Prancing Pony?
In Bree, the Prancing Pony.
Right. And they encounter the mysterious Strider.
Right.
Yeah, and I always wonder when I go back and I read this, I think, why does he play so coy with who he really is with the hobbits? Because earlier in the novel, Gandalf tells Frodo about Aragorn and actually mentions him by name. And I would think that if he said that name, that Frodo's ears would perk up. So let's talk a little bit about Strider, his introduction, and Aragorn, and everything that goes with that.
Well, we have Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son, has given us all of the drafts of Lord of the Ring. It takes up like 12 volumes, the drafts of all his stories. And in one of the drafts, when they go to Bree, Tolkien wrote in the margin, "Who is Strider? Who is this guy?" This is the part that he didn't plan ahead. Originally, Strider, for 4 drafts, he was a hobbit ranger named Trotter. His real name was Peregrine Boffin, and Peregrine means wanderer, like a peregrine falcon.
Yeah.
But later on, he gave that name to Pippin.
Pippin, yeah.
Even though Pippin doesn't wander, he's never been out of the Shire, but he just liked the name. So for a long time, he was a hobbit ranger. And when he says, "I know that I look foul," I think he's thinking of this gnarly little hobbit. Because later on, people don't talk about Aragorn being bad looking. He's very distinguished looking.
They say something like, "Sam, you couldn't look that bad if you slept in a ditch or something like that."
And so he really struggled with who this character was. And I think he must have gone back and added the part about "look for my friend Aragorn." They seem a little dense because when he gives his name, they don't go, "Oh, Gandalf told us about you." They do get into maybe you killed the real Aragorn.
Yeah.
Sometimes my students don't get the point of the rhyme about Aragorn. This is all that glitters.
I was going to ask about that because he says that
gold does not glitter.
Right.
He says those verses go with the name Aragorn.
Right.
What's going on there?
Well, it's all a prophecy. Does somebody have that? You have those lines, Crystal? The usual proverb is all that glitters is not gold, but the prophecy,
all that is gold does not glitter. He reverses it.
And that means this is a golden character. Aragorn is a very noble person who's going to do the good thing. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. He's a ranger. He's out there protecting the Shire. He's not lost at all. He just so this is basically the poem is about Aragorn. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. The rangers tend to live about 3 times as long as humans. So when you see his age as being 87, that means he's in his 30s in human years.
Gotcha.
From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadow shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. And that's describing a prophecy of Aragorn. And that's the first time we realize that eventually his blade is going to be reforged. He shows them the sword, which has been broken.
Yeah.
But this all came later. He had a lot of wonderful notes in the drafts. They have facsimiles of a number of them in Christopher Tolkien's volumes. One of them, he's getting toward the end of the long expected party and it's all this going on. And Tolkien just wrote in the margin, "Too many hobbits." And there's another one. For a long time, one of the friends they were not Merry and Pippin. They were Odo and Viggo. And about 100 pages into it, there's a marginal note that says, "No Odo." So it's fascinating to see his composition process.
Yeah. So so they meet Strider, Aragorn, we find out, and the Black Riders really start to factor in here towards the end of the first book, and somehow somebody releases all the horses and the ponies get out and they escape, and so they have to go find this one sad old pony that they purchase. But what I thought was fascinating in this section that stood out to me reading it again is that Tolkien gives us an account of the ponies.
He does, right.
Normally, in any sort of story, I don't know if you're watching a Western, back in the day or something, and the horses run off, or people are on an adventure and they get off their horse and the horse runs away. And then you just, that's the last time you hear about it. But Tolkien actually goes out of his way to tell us about the ponies and that they were brought back to Barliman Butterbur and they had a life, and that they never ended up making it to Rivendell, but they ended up being of use anyways. And you think like he seems to really care about the ponies and the creatures and the animals as if they're their own people, their own characters, worthy of stories.
Well, he really knew horses. He was in both school and the military. He would actually break horses. And, even though he wasn't physically big, he was really good with horses. He was kind of the horse whisperer of his regiment. And you can see that when he wants to account for, and the Bill the Pony has a lot of personality as the story keeps going on. I love the way he phrased that, though. He says, eventually they got back to the Shire and Barliman and Butterbur got them back, but they never saw Rivendell.
Yeah.
So it's almost like even though their lives were good, they never had the adventure they might have had if they hadn't been taken away by.
Yeah.
And then the book ends with rushing water of a river being like horses.
Yeah, it looks like horses.
And protecting the hobbits. So you get all these various levels of nature that are in support of this larger mission to destroy the power of evil.
I was just reading a book from Norse Saga, and they were talking about kinnings, like the ocean was the whale road, and the kinning for a ship was the ocean steed. So I wonder if he's playing with that kinning when the water comes rushing down with the horses' heads. It's the white horses' heads of the water that are sweeping away the black horses'
Well, and
steeds.
then they actually, it says that the water pulled in the other riders that were on the bank, so
to destroy them.
It's like the water itself has hands and is pulling them into the water.
Right.
Yeah. I wanted to mention that this is just one of the things that I love about Tolkien reading him is the language that he uses and the descriptive words. So I wanted to read one little phrase here before we wrap up. This is Tom Bombadil telling this old story, and he says, "Kings of little kingdoms fought together, and the young sun shone like fire on the red metal of their new and greedy swords."
Oh, yeah.
And Tolkien includes
hundreds of phrases like that.
Yeah.
Right,
and Tolkien includes all kinds of phrases and stories and even hints at stories. We get the sort of just preview of Beren and Luthien in the story, and we just get these sort of hints of the past. Almost as if he's trying to evoke this sense of Sehnsucht in yourself of the things that you remember. Sometimes even the way that he describes nature and creation and the scenes, it just really evokes these sense memories in yourself. That's, I feel, is very transformative as you read the story.
And he did that on purpose. Someone asked him, why didn't you explain all the historical allusions? And he said, in order to give a world depth, there have to be different languages, different cultures. There have to be some sense of historical realities that we don't know about. When they're with Tom Bombadil, they see a wall, and he says, not Tom Bombadil. Yeah, I think it's Tom Bombadil. And he says, he got a sad look on his face. Now, if you read the Silmarillion, you find out there was a great battle there where the men of Westerness were destroyed.
Yeah.
And then Merry has a dream when he's under a trance by the Barrow Wight. He dreams he's a dead king. He's been attacked by the forces of Carn Dûm.
Yeah.
So there are these allusions to history. If you go back and read Tolkien's other works, you'll find out. But in his own mind, he knew this was an old battlefield.
Yeah.
He knew this is where someone was killed. And of course, the sword they pick up from the Barrow Wight is going to become very important later in the story. I wanted to read one of those prose passages. I agreed about his prose style. When Frodo puts on the ring in order to hide from the Black Riders, it has the opposite effect. They can see him even better. And it says, he was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long gray robes. Upon their gray hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him. But it's almost poetry. There's this beautiful parallelism of, in this there was this, and this there was this.
Yeah.
And then their eyes pierce him, and later on he's going to be physically pierced by the sword. Yeah, so I love, part of what carries you along is the prose style.
He does a wonderful job with subverting your expectations of the words that you would use. And so instead of the fire being warm or hot, the fire is bright. And with the way that he describes things like that by using what feels like the perfect word to describe something, but it's not what you would expect, or it's not the word that we commonly use to describe something.
Which is just the definition of poetry.
Yeah.
I mean, the French call it le mot juste, the perfect word.
Yeah.
So Tolkien was a poet as well as an amazing fiction writer.
Yeah.
And that's a good place to stop.
Definitely.
Tune in for book 2.
What happens to Frodo? Does he live? The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. I am joined by my co-director at the Wade, David
and
C.
who are you? Now you're overcorrecting.
Okay, start over. Hello, this is Crystal Downing. Stop laughing.
Hey there, sailor. This is Crystal Downing.
Okay.
I'm going to start throwing these at the end of the podcast. It's an Easter egg.